Good morning, everyone. Oh, let's mute the computer. Great. All right, welcome to the second part of HTTP-BIS at IETF116. Hope everyone had a good week so far. You're almost at the end, just two more sessions to go. If you were here last time, if you're at any of the other sessions, you should be familiar with the note well. This is the terms under which we participate and contribute to the IETF. Please familiarize yourself with them. Do we want to look at our agenda? We do have a note taker. Thank you, Eric, for doing that. Yeah, how do we switch? Okay, cool. So on our agenda today, we have several items that are adopted already. We're going to start with presentation on resumable uploads. Mark's going to talk about some structured fields drafts, and then we're going to have a longer discussion from Mike on alt service. And then at the end, we do have some other proposed work around WebSocket discovery, HTTP Connect proxying, and HTTP availability. All right. Sorry, we're having some meet echo issues. So if there's any agenda bashing, let us know. And I think there's also one extra thing that Mark wanted to cover for the group.
So we'll just add it at the beginning, just so folks are aware. There was a presentation this week in the HTTP API working group. Oh, look, meet echo's coming back. Oh, that's you? Okay. From Austin Wright, who's up here at the front. And I guess there's a couple of different ways you can look at this work. One is how do we do a byte range update or patch or whatever of a resource, which is of course deeply integrated into HTTP, and we have probably lots of things to say about that. Another way of looking at it is that how do we create a new patch format, body payload that happens to use a byte range like mechanism. And so I didn't get that clarity of which end of the spectrum it was on from the discussion. I think Austin's still thinking about that. But I wanted to make sure folks here were aware, because especially if it's getting into the content range mechanism or relating to that, or saying, well, this is the best way to do this particular thing for HTTP, I think this group would probably want to be involved in that. So Austin, I don't know if you wanted to say anything else, but I just want to make sure folks here were aware of that discussion, and that it was, undoubtedly the HTTP API chairs and Tommy and I will have a chats if we feel like there needs to be coordination, or if the work needs to happen in one place or another or whatever. So anything else, or at the mic? Or this one, sure.
I brought the byte range patch to HTTP APIs. I did some form shopping. The mechanism, I hope, will play in a little bit to the next agenda item, which is resumable uploads. Thank you. And the essential mechanism is creating a way to write to a specific byte range in a file, which is essential for working with a lot of filed media types. But it could easily be purposed for like appending to streams, or if you need to pick up an upload to a stream at byte offset 2,000 bytes, you would be able to use this media type with a patch upload to be able to signal that. That's something that I think would be really useful for the next agenda item. And the reason it might be a little bit controversial is because at least one of the media type formats that I'm proposing uses the content range header as it was, which is already permitted in RFC 2110 with a put request. But it also proposes to do indefinite length requests, which is not something currently permitted. So there might be some, there is a little bit of overlap with HTTP-WG potentially, at least.
Thanks, Austin. So yeah, we'll just wait for more on that, but just so folks are aware at this point.
Great. So let's get started with resumable uploads. Bhavna.
Hello, everyone. My name is Bhavna, and I work at Apple. Today, I'll be representing the resumable uploads draft. Gaye and Marius couldn't be here in person, so I'll be presenting the updates. Next slide, please. So what's changed since the last draft? There are two major changes. First is the use of server-generated upload URLs, which replaced the client-generated tokens from the previous draft, and the introduction of a new header called upload incomplete, set to false, which is used for advertising client support. More updates. There's now Tusk.NET experimental server support, and Apple is actively investigating client implementations. Slide, please. Moving on to open issues. There are two major open issues, and the first one that's being actively discussed is how does client advertise support for resumable uploads. Doing this via the expect header doesn't seem to be a good fit based on the discussions right now. The preferred header way is still being discussed. And there's also the introduction of the new header, which the draft calls it upload incomplete, which when set to false, it's double negation and it's kind of hard to comprehend. So maybe it's, as I think Gaia suggested in the discussions, to rename that to upload complete. Yeah.
Just out of curiosity, do we want to have feedback and discussion on these as we go through them? Because I think we just have a couple more slides for the different issues, or do we want to come back?
I think I'll come back because that way others can jump in the queue online. The next open issue is what happens if a client receives a 500 from either the upload creation procedure or upload pending procedure? Should it retry? One way of solving this could be to use the upload complete header, mandate that in all the server responses. That way, if a client gets a 500 and the upload complete is set to true, the client should not retry. Next slide, please. This is just a list of other things that are being discussed right now. First is hashes of uploaded files. Second is prioritization of concurrent uploads, which sounds mostly like an API issue or like a client implementation thing that need not be part of this draft. And two others, resumable upload with forms and upload progress via informational responses, which sounds like a good thing to do, but doesn't look like it's going to make it to the first draft. And also, we need to sync up on the byte range, the patch mechanisms, and I'm sure Gaia and others will be reaching out to you on that. I think the next steps would be to close on these discussion items and get more developer feedback and incorporate that in the draft moving forward. Questions?
Do we have specific? Oh, cool. Marius.
Hello. Hopefully you can all hear me well. Regarding the issue about the error response, I would say, like, from my feeling of using resumable uploads in production, if the client receives a 500 or something similar, and it doesn't indicate that the upload was complete, then I would say, this could be some intermediate proxy that has responded with an error. So I think in that case, it should be retried because the client couldn't confirm that the upload was complete, and therefore it should retry as specified.
Martin Thompson, having this indicator from a proxy or something like that would be very, very unusual, I would think. I imagine that in the case where you got an error from a proxy and it indicated that it had completed the process of uploading, which is essentially what this is supposed to indicate, I would ignore that at that point. I would not believe it. I would not believe it if the server did that. I'm looking for it. I would be looking for a 200 series response with this before I started paying attention to it at all. Yeah. I did want to briefly comment on the use of this label on requests. That's going to be quite confusing, I think, because as it is used by the server, it's a statement about the conclusion of a process. It's saying that this process has concluded, whereas the client saying this process has concluded even before it starts that process is odd, I think.
Got it. Yeah.
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 Right. So, Kazuhoku, thank you for making progress, especially regarding the issue 2312 that we have been just making comments. I think it's generally a good idea to provide the response from the server as we have in the signals, or as Martin pointed out, probably might make, to me it seems that probably it makes more sense to put it in the body rather than the header and using a head request. And also, I think that probably we should have a editorial section saying that the response has to be cached by the server because the client might finish the upload, then the connection dies, and then the client has to refetch the response, probably multiple times. So I think it'll be a good idea to have some editorial comment like that, but it's editorial. Thank you very much. Thank
you. Good.
Thank you. All right, next up, we have Marks.
Try and share my whole screen and see if that makes a difference.
Bear with us on the Meet Echo. It's doing some interesting things today.
For the simplicity of HDMI. Well, we don't necessarily need to I'm just going to go over the issues and so forth. Yep, that didn't work. Okay. So the first spec to talk about here is structured field values BIS. We trunked through a number of the issues on this in the last few weeks. And there's currently, the editor's draft reflects all those changes. We missed the submission deadline, and I have neglected to push the button during this week. So if you look at the editor's draft, that should be up to date. I'll go ahead and push the button after this session so we have a current draft. Once that's published, the only open issue we have is 2343, explore the solution space for non-ASCII characters in strings. And so for this draft, since I'm editing it, Tommy is acting as the sole chair for this draft. And in consulting with him, his advice was that because this issue was out of the scope that we agreed to when we opened up structured fields BIST, we'd hold off on discussion of it until last call and see if it comes up during the last call. So I think we're pretty much at that time. I still hear a little bit of back and forth about the date type and whether it's going to be used, but I think we have pretty strong consensus in this group that it's in the form that we want it to be in. So that seems to be concluded, and so I think the next steps are I'll press the button on this spec and we'll initiate the working group last call for the spec. I don't know if you think it'd be useful to discuss this issue at all in this meeting or not, or.
Sorry. If people do have any particularly strong opinions that they'd like to express now, I think that would be useful since we are in the room and here, and we can potentially have a higher throughput discussion than on the list.
Okay, my name is Martin Durst, and those who know me will probably guess that I have a strong opinion on this issue. There are very, very few HTTP header fields where there is a need to actually have non-ASCII characters. But in those cases, they have a need, and up to now, they were kind of, well, they messed around. Yeah, there are actually different solutions there, and it doesn't look good. And HTTP headers actually from the start were defined as Latin 1, which was at the time when Tim Berners-Lee came up with HTTP, was kind of the only game or the main game in town. So, but it would be good if we could fix that. And what I was a little bit disappointed is that when this issue was discussed on the list, I don't want to say which editor said which thing, but the editor said things like, well, I have problems with my own email, and I regularly get things where non-ASCII characters are messed up. And if that's the case, this editor maybe should somehow update his software, because that's not how it works these days. Yeah, it works much better, fortunately. And I think the other editor said something to the point like, I don't want people to use non-ASCII characters where it's not necessary. And in most cases, it's not necessary. And I agree with that. But then he said, well, and in order to make that even this case stronger, I want it to be that there is a mess and people don't really know what the solution would be and so on. And I think that's not exactly what the IETF is about. Okay, so thank you.
So speaking as the other editor in that scenario, I'll let you infer who the first editor is, I guess. I don't think I said I'd prefer it to be a mess. I have reservations about making it too easy because, because of the history and because of how we train developers, people reach for Unicode by default, which in many contexts is a very good thing. I think in the context of HTTP header processing for protocols, it is more complex or more nuanced than most people realize. I'm not against enabling it if we need to enable it. I think it's just our current solution for it is that you use either a binary or you use a string with a particular encoding like percent encoding, which we had in another spec and then we ripped out at a later point. The other solution that would be on the table, I think, would be to add a new type, just as we've added date, to structured fields to handle Unicode characters and encode them in some fashion. I think there are a lot of arguments for and against that. Having one way to do it is something that Julian would like to see, and I can understand why, because we did have a preferred way to do that beforehand in RFC 60, whatever it was, for HTTP parameters, and that was just for parameters, unfortunately. So we could do that. I guess the concern here is that when we opened up this work, we scoped it pretty tightly, and that adding this, I think technically is not terribly difficult. Whether it's going to entail a tremendous amount of discussion in the group is maybe another thing. And I think maybe the high order bit decision here is, do we do it now when the spec is open and reduce the number of times we have to iterate on this spec? Or do we say we'll do it in the next iteration and give ourselves more time to discuss it properly? And you know, because a lot of when we open this work, and I think maybe the other big piece of information is that a lot of people wanted it to be done very quickly. And that's why that was the context of why we did this. So I think that's the decision that we have is, you know, if we're going to do it, do we do it now or do we say we're going to do it later? Martin.
Yeah, I'd like to have a discussion about the discussion that we're going to have to build a plan to discuss the thing.
We need to discuss that.
And right. I want to talk about the issue. I think we should do this. I think we should do it, as you say, in a reasoned fashion. But let's talk about the issue right now, right here. I think we have a number of options in front of us. We can look at some sort of escaping system or encoding or what have you. That's on the sort of end of things that we've tried before, and it's ugly and people don't really like it, and it hasn't worked out particularly well. We can go to the complete other end of the spectrum and say, look, you can just shove arbitrary Unicode in the strings in structured fields. It means that new structured field parsers will generate and accept Unicode, and old ones will be in an interesting position. So it has some interesting compatibility concerns that we might want to work our way through. We decided that when we added date, there were some interesting implications for parsers, and it meant that new specifications were the only ones that could really pick up the new type with any expectation of interoperability. And then there's sort of the third option in the middle, which is to define a new type that allows you to do strings with Unicode in them, which has much of the same properties as the date thing. New parsers would be able to do the new thing, and old parsers wouldn't. And you would have some surprises in those cases where people sent the new thing, the new type, into the old parser, but it's not a big deal. I'm not particularly concerned about that when we have some text in the draft that already deals with this particular problem. So I kind of like that one. I was originally a big fan of the just shove the Unicode in there. That seems to be the approach that some header fields have taken on the web, out of our control perhaps, but that's how I think content disposition is one of the ones that works that way. Or is it location? It's location. Location will take arbitrary Unicode in browsers, and that's not great.
Specifically in browsers, though.
Yeah. I specifically said in the web, and
the web is not just browsers.
That's not great. Well, we don't do it because we want to do it. We do it because the servers send us these things, right? And for some reason, we're tolerant of that sort of thing. Thank you, Pastel. So I'd like to set those options up. If you can put them on the screen, that'd be awesome. If you can't, well, thanks, Medeco.
We can't, yeah.
But I'd like to have a discussion about those options and see what people think about them. Now, I don't know if you have time for that here.
We're running out of it rapidly.
Okay, let's go then.
So if I can respond to that briefly, you know, to get my cards on the table, I think I agree with you. I think the right thing to do here is to define a new type. I kind of did a thought experiment of that using the percent encoding approach that I had spec'd out in the HTTP API spec. It's very simple. It looks like structured fields. It works. I think the problem here is that this is a contentious topic. There are people who think the right thing to do is to just shove Unicode into the headers. And that is a very complex and probably contentious discussion that is not going to end anytime soon. And so, you know, we do need to talk about what we're going to talk about, because some people came into this whole endeavor with the notion that we were going to get done quickly.
Let me briefly respond to that. I think we have this discussion. We resolve this discussion at the pace that it resolves itself. And if it does resolve itself before we get too far down the path on the revision of the document, we can talk about bringing it in. But we don't proceed with the 8941 BIS with the understanding that we're going to include the string thing. We just go ahead and publish it, and we'll do a revision like next week if we have to.
So you're saying launch the working group last call, keep processing going, but see if we can resolve this in the meantime.
Right, and if we come up with a solution really quickly that makes sense and everyone agrees that it goes back in, we just pull it back. I
think that's what you wanted, basically.
Yeah, that's essentially what I was leading to.
Yeah,
we do the last call. It wasn't in the scope. We can always revise more, and if we all agree, then we can edit it in.
Kazuho, did you want to?
Well, technical.
Okay.
Yeah, so first point, I wanted to apologize to Mark if that I somewhat cited him not exactly correctly. And second is that I'm personally fine with both in terms of technical and in terms of procedural, either to do it in a quick thing after this one, or to do it with this one if we manage to be even faster, and also in terms of the solution that we take. I definitely would personally prefer to have just UTF-8, not just Unicode, because that's, yeah, I know that you don't mean it, but that's not if people say we want something different, then let's do that one if that gets consensus. Thank you.
Thanks, Martin. No offense taken, for what it's worth. I would note that if we do decide, you know, if we are able to come to consensus that putting UTF-8 in headers is the right thing to do, we'll need to open up 9110 as well.
So that's the end of the queue. Julian, you had been in the queue and you had turned on your audio, and I had muted you, but would you like to speak?
Yeah, I unqueued myself several times because Martin was saying the right things. One thing I wanted to reiterate is that when we had this big discussion in November, I think, one thing that we've actually found out is that the extensibility model of structured fields is not as, or was not as clear as we thought it was, meaning that it turned out that actually modifying structured fields and their implementations is a bit harder than expected. So I think we made good progress on clarifying that. So I'm not that concerned about future evolution anymore as I was before. So if we are saying we can't do it right now, but we may want to look at this as a next step, that's good. While I'm on the queue, I'm a bit confused that Martin is now saying UTF-8 is the only sensible option. I guess we should probably have, for those who are actually interested in this, maybe a design team and make a common proposal and then come back to the working group so that we don't spend too much working group time coming up with a single proposal. And that's it.
Cool, thank you. So what I'm hearing is that we'll do the last call and let's in parallel kick off proper technical discussion on this issue and just do the work, and we'll move on from there. All right, so I think that covers structure fields. Yes, do you want to have anything to say on retrofit?
Sorry, on retrofit? So the retrofit spec is the next one, and that's in much the same state. Almost all the issues have been closed. I need to publish a new draft. I think it's more straightforward. The only issue that's remaining is 2280, which is to add mappings for the authorization and www authenticate headers. And I think we got into a discussion where, because these this is a very extensible field, there are different schemes, and they have their own syntax and their own semantics and their own especially parameters, for example, and those have different types. I felt that if we were going to do this, we would need to create a mapping that included scheme-specific information. So went and enumerated, when you see this parameter, the value has this type, and so forth and so on. Other folks didn't seem to think that was necessary. So I think that's the sticking point on this one. We could publish this spec without that, and of course another spec could go into that detail, and maybe that's the right thing to do here, because this spec doesn't, by its nature, have to be complete. It just has to be a start of this idea of retrofitting headers into structured fields. Does anybody have any thoughts about that? Because I guess as an editor, my inclination is to close this issue and go to working group last call. And sorry, I'll paste a link since, although we're now having trouble with both with MeetEcho and GitHub, so yay Friday. Let's see if Zulip still works.
So any comments? So this is essentially, should we retrofit authorization and authenticate?
Mike Bishop. I guess my inclination would be that if it's going to be fairly complex, to not just to do it, but to know if we're right. We're too late in the process for that, and maybe it's better to do that as a separate draft. Although I'm aware that pushing additional RFCs costs money, but I don't want to hold this one up.
Just as individual here, I think this issue was filed in some of the discussions that Chris and I were having for some new auth schemes, etc. I definitely appreciate that new auth schemes and even the existing ones can have different interior formatting. So being able to fix this holistically is tricky. Do we think there's anything we could do, at least for as we are defining new auth schemes, give advice for how they represent things? Because at least let's say the actual scheme itself is a token, or we can retrofit that part, and then we say then there are other things, and if you're writing one of these, you have to do that. And so we don't try to enumerate the existing ones, but maybe just give something so that new specs can reference it and not say you're in the Wild West.
Right. I mean, certainly the kind of third way we could do this would be to just define the fields and say that, okay, we're going to define the mappings for, let's say, basic and digest, or maybe bearer or something, and any other scheme either has to define its own mapping, or you can't use it with this retrofit header. I think that would be workable and pretty safe to do. So that I think that would lower the bar for new schemes to be able to do that, is what you're saying, and that's not a bad thing. But yeah, if we try and be completist about it, I think that's a lot of work, and as Mike points out, potentially a lot of risk that we're doing it right. This does involve kind of a background concern I have about this spec that I think we can address, but by defining these mappings and whether it's the compatible route or the mapping route that we have in this spec, we're implying that fields are future extensions to those fields are going to work within the constraints we're setting, or at least have a good chance of working. I mean, the whole concept of retrofit is that if parsing fails, you fall back to, or you can't represent it in a retrofit header, you fall back to the quote unquote normal representation, the non-structured representation. But it does kind of imply it has implications for the ecosystems that are using those headers. And so, for example, when we did the cookie work, I went and talked to the cookie folks to make sure they were comfortable with the fact that we were saying how to interpret or how to represent the data structures that they have in their fields in separate structured fields. And they were comfortable with that, so that's good. But I think we probably need to do a little legwork in working group last call and talk to the other communities that this might touch upon to make sure that they're okay with these implications. But you know, and that includes, I think, if we do dub authenticate the security folks who are using this. Yeah, all that said for this issue, I'm fine with that third way. I don't know if Mike, if you have any thoughts, but that seems reasonable to me. Julian, sorry.
I still don't completely get why you're saying that we need OS scheme-specific mappings to structured fields. Right now, the OS scheme syntax is essentially a scheme plus OS params, and OS params are, let's say, tokens or strings. It's essentially the same type of grammar as in cache control. So if we need this for all schemes, why don't we have that for cache control, for instance?
So what if one of those tokens is an integer, Julian?
Yeah, so why don't we same question for cache control?
Because cache control is controlled by a registry, and so far we haven't had any issues with the mappings there.
So what I'm trying to say is I think you are overcomplicating the issue, because we already have a relatively flexible syntax for all schemes, although it's bizarre on the wire. And what I hear is that we need more than token and string. And I'm not sure this is true for all schemes. And if it's true for all schemes, then it probably is true for many other fields where we don't have it either. So maybe it's simpler than you think.
I agree with you. I'm not sure either. But there are a lot of auth schemes out there that aren't well documented, and I'm just concerned that we're going to come across a situation where one of them passes a token that is, for example, the number 1 followed by some characters, some letters, or a hyphen or whatever, and that will fail to parse as a structured field. But it's completely valid by the semantics of that particular auth scheme. And I don't know of such a situation. I can go and try and find it in the existing registered auth schemes. But you mentioned cache control. We have a pretty good sense of what is going to be in a cache control header because we control the registry. And there are relatively few unregistered cache control directives. Auth schemes are a bit more broad. And so I want to be careful before we make assumptions about what's in those data structures. So perhaps I should go off and look around a little bit more and see if we can find some examples to illustrate this, Julian. Okay, so why don't we try and resolve that a little bit more, and then we'll go to working group last call. That makes sense? Okay.
Okie dokie. So next up, I think we have Mike. Mike, do you want to share from your phone? I can preview that you could.
Oh, so can't do slides, but maybe do desktop.
No, we can do slides.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm just suggesting you can do it, and that way, if our computers get kicked off, we can switch off whoever's able to share.
Go. All right. So we've been talking about alt service for a while, and this morning we're going to be talking about an alternative to alt service, which seems thematically appropriate. really this feels a lot like you come in to a restaurant, you get the menu, you go to order, and they give you a different menu and ask you to order off of that one. So what we've arrived at so far is that we'd really like to have a division of responsibility between DNS and this alt service header, which currently can give you, alt service can give you anything from a different host, a different port, a different protocol, and potentially parameters for connecting to those things. And the realization that we had last time around was that really DNS is the best place to give you authoritative information about the endpoint that you're connecting to. And the only thing we really need to get in real time from the server is a directive to switch to a different endpoint, which might have different properties, and you'd really like to get those from the DNS too. So that's the way the current alternative draft is structured. So there are lots of cases where this might be an interesting capability, whether that's DNS pointed you to the wrong place, or Anycast landed you in the wrong place, or we discover now that we've talked to you that you are an enlightened client who supports more features than we have on the server, so we'd like to send you to a similarly enlightened server. Or, load jetting. It's not critical yet, but you will have a better lifetime if you go somewhere else quickly. So let's walk through some examples. We're now relying on service B records, HTTPS records, to make these decisions at connect time. So let's say you look up your HTTPS records for example.com. You find these three possibilities. One of them is H3, it's got ECH support. There's a fallback that only does H2, and there's another fallback that says, yeah, really only use this one if I told you you needed to. And so, of course, we'll take the top priority one because it has all the features we want, and it's the top of the priority list. Okay, that's what we want. And then at some point while we're talking to the server realizes that it is on fire, and it would like you to go somewhere else. Probably in an emergency situation, that would be a go away, this connection cannot continue. But if it notices before it gets to that point, it will start trying to shift clients to go somewhere else more gracefully. So it gives you this header that says, you want the Yokohama fallback list. You go look that up, and you find, well, here are some alternatives that will work in the Yokohama area. You might have a backup that supports H3. You have backup 2 that supports H2 and ECH. You might want to go to Tokyo and support something there. So, top of the priority list, we take the top one that doesn't support ECH. That's what the draft currently says. We'll get to that in a minute because that might not be what you want to do. But then on a future connection, you go back to that same lookup, you find the same results. This time around, you notice that the backup you were told to use before is in the list, even if it's not the most preferred one. So we keep using the backup because it is still in the list that we found. And if we come back at some point in the far future and the backup isn't there, we're in the same selection process originally. We just go back to what the list says in real time. So that is a very quick walkthrough of how the current draft would function. But that leads us to a lot of open questions with this draft that I think we need to resolve, and we need to get answers for so we know what to put in there and where this draft is headed. So let's talk about some of them. One of the first pieces that this draft throws out support for, that alt service currently gives you, is being able to point directly to some other host that you want the client to go to. The draft right now gives you a host name that you do an HTTPS query for. You can't do an HTTPS query for an IP address. If you do an HTTPS query for a host name and don't find any results, you don't connect to that host name you were given. So if you don't have the DNS infrastructure to put up some alternative DNS host names to hang these records off of, you won't be able to do this. Now, likely if you're going to be using this, you have enough of a DNS infrastructure that you can spin some host names, add some extra records, that should work. But this is definitely a capability loss. And so I think we want to confirm with the working group that that is something we're okay saying we don't need that problem, we don't need that capability. So does anyone want to get in the mic line and say, yes, we need it, or no, we're comfortable jettisoning it, or do we just not care?
Alex. Hi, Alex Chernovsky. Wow, this mic has a lot of gain. I have more a question than a comment here, because this looks a lot like quick server migration to me. Like you could specify, like, here's a new preferred server address. And it'd be kind of cool to do that with H2 and not have to do that with H3. And that's what you'd be giving up, it feels like. Because if I had, for example, a CDN with customer certs, even if I could spin up another host name, it might not necessarily match the host name of the original cert. And presumably, if the browser was to follow that, I'm assuming you'd be following the host names there. Like, how would you expect that to work?
So the way it works when you make the new connection is similar to the way alt service did, that it expects the new endpoint to still have a certificate for the origin that you're talking to.
So what you're giving up here is just the ability to specify an IP address, but the DNS isn't actually going to play into the certificate matching.
DNS does not play into certificate matching at all. So you start with an origin, you're looking for a resource at a particular URL, and you will always be looking for the cert that is in the origin of that URL.
Okay, so it sounds like then you're not giving up that much. Am I understanding that correctly? Like you have to build a DNS infrastructure to serve these records, but you're not actually losing the capability?
Right. The capability that you're losing is just to be able to point directly at an IP address or host name with a port number and not have to have any coordinated DNS updates.
Okay, in that case, my opinion is that sounds fine.
Okay. All right. All right, good, it's still connected. All right, then we will move on then. So the next piece that I called out while we were walking through the example, there is currently no requirement in the draft that the alternative has to be equivalent or better to the host that you're talking to right now. So, for example, you had an ECH capable host that you found originally. It told you you need to go to the fallback list, and the top host on the fallback list was not ECH capable. Technically, there's nothing in the draft that says you should not do that. There might be in the ECH draft, but that doesn't quite cover this situation. So we might want to add some text that says you filter it. We might want to say something about only if you used ECH on the original case, do you want to require ECH on the next one? Or we might say if you're in a fallback situation or the server's telling you to go elsewhere, then the server knows best, follow your normal logic. Do we want to be prescriptive here, or do we just want to follow the usual connection selection logic? And if that incorporates ETH, it incorporates ECH.
Go for it.
So I think that the DNS service B draft, before the recent changes to remove all of the ECH stuff, was very good about talking about the things in this particular area in terms of how you might think about it. I think the way we might sort of frame this is that clients will have a particular policy with respect to the endpoints that they select when they're presented with a list of options in HTTPS records. They will then initiate connections, and ultimately maybe one of those connections will succeed.
Mm-hmm.
If that connection contains ECH, The client's policy may well change in response to that, but ultimately it's still just a question of what the client's policy is at that point. And I think if we frame the text in that way, we may be able to sort of work our way past all of these problems. So let me make that more concrete. If you connect to a server and you get quick, and you like quick, you might decide that you won't entertain any alternatives that don't also provide you with quick, right? That's a perfectly legitimate decision that you might make at that point. You might extend that to ECH. If you get ECH, okay, we're now successfully protecting the client hello, and particularly things like SNI. I would like to retain that property for any alternatives at this origin, because now this origin has given me the opportunity to use ECH, and I like that very much, and would prefer not to see it regress, even though the server might prefer that I go to an alternative at this point. So I think if we frame it that way, which is not quite the same way that 7838 did, I think we might be in a better position.
Okay. So to restate that, I think you're saying that the client will have a selection policy and it should apply that selection policy to the alternatives it's given. Mm-hmm. And one of the options that it should consider is not following the alternative.
Not using an alternative is always possible for a client, yes.
Correct.
I think the refinement here is that the client's policy may be updated for a given origin based on how it is communicated with that origin in the past, particularly when presented with an alternative. Mm-hmm. Now, it might be the case that you connect to an origin and it has ECH, and then you later connect to the origin and it doesn't have ECH. That's not really a situation in which you have an existing connection, mm-hmm. and you might have to accept that fact and deal with the fact that ECH has been turned off on that origin. But then when you're presented with an alternative in this way, you do have a functional connection that has ECH on it. It might be the case that you decide that your policy is refined in this particular case.
David Benjamin. So that works for HPS records very straightforwardly because we see all the examples at once and we don't need any kind of stickiness. Like the problem with stickiness is that it means that like while that's strictly a client policy, if the server, it has implications on whether the server can safely turn something off. And any kind of policy here, I think you sort of alluded to this in the second half, that like it inherently involves some kind of client stickiness, like maybe not like right at the time when we get the alt service policy because we have two connections, but I'm assuming the alt service B is going to last for like a couple of requests at least. And then we like, I think that we might need to be a little more careful about the bounds. And I personally would prefer solutions without stickiness. We just don't have to think about this, but it does mean we sort of need to write down like what this is. Because like in other cases, when a service is multi-homed, like we already have to say like, okay, your baseline security is like the weakest of all the services that can speak on behalf of this name. Like suppose you have one server that speaks TLS 1.2 and one server that speaks SSL 3, and there's a client that still supports both. Then like it doesn't matter what the DNS does, an attacker can always direct you to the weakest one. And so we sort of already have this baseline unstated policy that like you need to like roughly equivalently deploy all of your servers roughly because, you know, in transition things don't work out. So I think that might be the better story here rather than like trying to rely on like client stickiness and have us like remember every single little negotiable policy and like sort of apply it there.
So can I ask you to define stickiness as you're using it there? Because I'm about to talk about stickiness and I don't think we're saying exactly.
It's quite possible I am misunderstanding the scope of alt service B. Stickiness to me means like I connected to you previously and then I sort of like ad hoc remember like, oh, you know, 5 minutes later or an hour later or a week later, the fact that I previously information about how I previously connected to you impacts how I connect to you now. Oh, that's not what you're saying. Okay, well, please do. I'm
a little bit.
So I'm only talking about the action that you take when you see the new header field. that at that instant when you have a connection and you're looking to decide whether you make a new connection and use that instead for future requests. It's only that decision that we're talking about right here. We're not talking about in 3 days' time or 4 days' time or any of those sorts of other things. We'll get back to the stickiness question later. I think the stickiness one is nasty in this one, and it's probably one of the weakest parts of this, but this is just that decision where you've got a connection and you're presented with the option of replacing that connection with another one. What policy do you apply to that decision?
So then I guess the question of what we decide for stickiness for this thing will impact our options for the other question. All right, cool. We are on the same page, I think.
So if we look at the example of when it gives you the alternative list, you're currently connected to a server that supports H3 and ECH. You get this list of alternatives. The top one supports H3. The second one supports ECH. Do you take either of those or none of those? And I think that's really the question here of, do we follow the direction to move, or do we say, nah, neither of these alternatives are as good in my opinion as the host I'm on, so let me stay here.
Eric Orth. I'm completely having trouble imagining a case where a client would want to downgrade ECH. They're all going to be in the case where if they have ECH before, they're going to want to keep having ECH. And so, yeah, in some cases, the client has the ability to enforce that self. It has a nice ECH supporting connection here, is looking at alternatives, and I'm supporting ECH. Okay, screw that, we're not going to go any of those. But in other cases, it's especially depending on all the stickiness and stuff that's not really being completely discussed yet, it's might be difficult in some cases for the client, and in the very least, it should be in the draft that much more strongly similar to other stuff like SVCB that you should not be giving clients options that would downgrade their ECH. If you have it, you should only be offering ECH. And in the very least, that should be a should, maybe even a must. But nobody's going to want to downgrade, and we want to make it so, as in many cases it's possible for the client to not downgrade.
Eric Kinnear, Apple. I think this is nice to think about, and we could totally define our ramp of what we think we should switch to or not. But at the end of the day, there's always a chance that we can't get to the place you're telling us to go. So you're going to have to deal with the fact that a client might choose not to switch.
Yes.
So, like, I mean, yes, it's nice. Yes, a should for please don't offer people wildly insecure things when they were currently on a nice secure thing. Like, let's try to reduce the chances that somebody who's not paying attention screws it up. But at the end of the day, like, I don't think you can, it's not worth putting a ton of energy into trying to funnel exactly what the client behavior is going to do here, because we may or may not be able to do whatever it is that you're asking.
And what we've seen with the original generation of alt service is client behavior may not be what we expect. Okay.
I jumped in the queue.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, sorry. Just as kind of one follow on to that, I agree with what people are saying. I'm wondering, if we're in this edge case where all of the alternatives no longer have good properties that were present in the original, I know that when we're following this, we are resolving the alternative as the query. But I think earlier someone had mentioned, well, it could be that the original names also drop ECH support, like the entire, all of the servers could drop it at some point.
Right.
In which
you might
case,
be about to get a go away, and then you'll just
in which case there's no point. And I imagine maybe we could have some non-normative advice that if you see something and it looks like this configuration is totally changing, maybe if you're about to make the decision that you don't want to have any alternatives, in parallel, just issue a new query for the original name and see if that property has disappeared from the main one, because then you're essentially under the impression that, well, this property has disappeared everywhere, and so maybe I may as well take the alternative. And that allows the DNS deployment and the server deployment to make things work better if they uniformly remove ECH. And essentially the only bad case that remains is a case in which their primary has a good property and all of their alternatives have a bad property. I mean, to say, that's just going to discourage clients from switching. If you actually care about doing alt service, don't do that.
Yes. Or you could just stay on your original connection and see if you get a go away.
Yeah, that too.
All right. So now talking about stickiness. The way the draft defines it, well, before I get into the way the draft defines it for right now, what we would ideally like stickiness to look like is that once you've been given an alternative, you continue to use that alternative as long as the server that gave you the alternative is still authorized to do so. So you're still being routed to the same CDN if you're in a multi-CDN case. The server still wants you, and the origin still wants you to be going there, and the client should immediately stop using the alternative when those conditions change, which is a great exercise in clairvoyance, and the client will never actually know when that's the case. That was kind of the problem with persistence in the original alt service, that if you set a long lifetime, then DNS might change out from underneath you, and you wind up going to an alternative hosted by a CDN that no longer has that host name on it. Or you look up a host name that now points to a different CDN and doesn't support H3. Those are some of the pain points from the original alt service. So we'd really like this to go away when it's supposed to go away. And the response to that has been to set ridiculously short lifetimes on alt service, like say 1 minute. Like, I'd really like you to go over here, and then I guess you have to ask me again the next time you make a connection. None of those are great solutions. We're trying to do a little bit better this time around, but that is challenging. The way this draft currently achieves that is with two pieces. First, there is a new service param defined for HTTPS records, which is alt only. It means even though this host is in the list, never pick it unless you're explicitly told to. And secondly, if you return, when you are returning to an origin and you do your lookup, if you find the host that you previously landed on from an alt service record, keep picking it. Even if it's number 3 on the list, even if it's number 20 on the list, keep picking the one that you picked before. So that has its own issues, which means as long as you want that alternative to continue to be used, you have to continue listing it in the HTTPS responses, which I work for a CDN that does not particularly want to publish all of its nodes in every DNS response. And even if we were willing to, that gets to be a really, really big DNS response because we have a lot of nodes. So probably that only works for particular host names if we can guess where you might have been routed before. It might be nice to have some kind of named way to invalidate or reauthorize an alternative. So far, the only suggestion for doing that would require changes to how service B records work fundamentally, and that's not likely to happen with it in the RFC editor queue again. So this is not a great design for stickiness, but it's the best one we've come up with so far. Do we have other suggestions here? Do we have requirements that we might want to loosen, or is this acceptable for moving forward? Or maybe as David said, we don't like stickiness and maybe we just drop this. I think we want some stickiness, but we need to figure out exactly where we are. Ben.
Hi, Ben Schwartz. The first thing that comes to mind is if your example before you had backup-yoko. You know, I could imagine saying, okay, the service param is alt equals backup-yoko. And that's how the main HTTPS records on the origin authorize a backup set. And so, you know, that allows you to retract the authorization immediately, but doesn't require enumerating the entire backup set in the main RR set.
So service param that lists the host names, the domain names that you have been asked to look up before.
So it essentially adds one layer of batching where I instead of needing to concatenate all of the distinct HTTPS RRs for all of the alts into a single RR set, they can be broken into various RR sets, 10 each, and then I can enumerate each of those in the main one.
Okay. Yes, that might work, and that might be cleaner than the current design. So let's exchange some mail about that. We'll see if we can get a PR together and see what that might look like. Eric?
Another approach that I haven't fully thought through would be to have a service param that's a label that would exist on both the original as well as any of the alt services. And the requirement would be that whatever that labeled service param was would be like a group label, and it needed to match between the two for stickiness. The thing that might not work so well is there might be some adversarial cases. There's nothing really forcing those to match, but if we can think through what those adversarial cases would be, it may be that at least for that, like if that was the name of the CDN as example as a label, then when there's a mismatch between these equivalence classes, you'd be able to detect it and not use it.
So which record would you put that service param on? Because there was a proposal on GitHub that we add a service param to an alias mode record, which isn't supported in the service B draft right now, but would maybe have a nicer solution. But without that, I'm not sure which record should get the service param that has to match.
And I was thinking that all of them would have it. So it would require that the host returning the alt service B was a path you got to through a service B record. It wouldn't work if you got to it directly through A or quad A fallback. But if it was through a service B record, then all of the service B records for that equivalent class would all of that same service param label.
Okay. Thank you.
Cool. Martin? Yeah, so just on that particular point, I think Eric's idea is one that was floated by, I think, Jeremy Sackblatt on GitHub. Okay. It's a perfectly reasonable idea, and I think it's one that we should probably explore. The option that we chose here is a little weird in some ways, and it might be at the cost of extra bytes in records. We're able to do something that's a little more direct and explicit. So I definitely think it's worthwhile exploring this. I just sort of wanted to point out that the way that we've built this, some of the stickiness that we've got here is necessary. In particular, there's one point of stickiness that's kind of critical. If you have a server that advertises an alternative on every single response that it sends to a client, we don't want the client trying the same alternative on every single request. That would be unwelcome, I think, at best. The design that we're talking about here is probably more for when you come back to the server. Right. What do you do in that circumstance? And I think there we've got a number of different options. I'm not particularly happy with the one that we have. I think it kind of works, but it's a little, I guess, it relies on implicit identification to some level. That's not really very pleasant. So if we can get away from that, that would be nice. I think that a lot of this comes down to people who are provisioning DNS and setting things up what they would prefer and what their requirements are.
And how quickly can they update it?
Yeah, I think one of the key realizations here is that we need some sort of label that sits in the DNS that you can just change to completely invalidate all of the things that were attached to the previous label. And we were using names here, and I think because they're names, that's a lot more awkward. And so if we as much as I don't like adding extra layers of abstraction when they're unnecessary because they bloat things out, but this one may be one of those cases where we want to do that sort of thing.
Alex?
Hi, Alex Shnahovsky. So I think I managed to convince myself that stickiness is actually probably a bad idea from a load balancing perspective.
Okay.
If we go and look at generally the three types of load balancing that we have either DNS-based load balancing, Anycast, or a strategy that YouTube calls client mapping, where we basically like give you a URL to a unique VIP specific to where we think the content should be.
Mm-hmm.
And particularly in the DNS load balancing case and the client mapping case, we frequently end up with servers with the same sort of wildcard certificate covering them and the types of origins that they can serve. And if we have these really long-lived H2 or H3 connections, it's frequently not a good idea to have the stickiness information there and have the client remember where it was, because it increases the latency for the long tail of how quickly we can shift traffic around without having to use this feature. So you basically end up in a situation where the DNS or otherwise mapping request that you get has sent you somewhere different from where the client thinks it should go, and you end up taking like at least another round trip to actually end up with a server which has your content or is not overloaded.
Mm-hmm.
So I think my preference here is try to leverage existing DNS and H2 connections as much as possible with those load balancing decisions, and only really use these sorts of features in exceptional cases. And that means no stickiness and no additional complexity.
Okay. So either no stickiness at all or a way to say don't be sticky.
Yeah, and I think more specifically, like one of the things that I was thinking about while I was skimming the draft here is I also have questions around how long do these information last and like how frequently do you follow them? Like, especially with the the frame type. Like what happens if you have an H2 connection and then every minute you get all service be redirected somewhere else? Do we have a limit where after like 7 redirects, like with 300 PXX series, you fall off the chain? Or like, there's just so many questions here about like, this becomes an active control channel for load balancing that like, it feels like a lot of complexity. So I feel like we need to cut off the complexity at some point and say beyond this is out of scope at some point.
Right. So the way the draft currently addresses that is if you get a repeat frame telling you to go to the same alternative, you ignore it if you've already tried that one and you choose not to move.
Right, but what happens if like...
If they alternate between go to backup Yoko, go to backup Tokyo, backup Yoko, backup Tokyo. Currently there is no... I don't think there is anything that says you should give up on alternatives if they keep sending you a different one.
Yeah, but I feel like that could end up DOSing a client.
Yes.
Like, as a result, my inclination is maybe cut back on the minimum set of problems we're trying to address, make that ironclad, and then maybe go start adding some more of these features.
No. David?
David Benjamin. So to briefly pick back up on the thread that I dropped previously, if the stickiness answer is anything but like no across the board, so like even if there's optional stickiness, now that limits what options we have for the ECK question, because if there's the stickiness thing, now the client doesn't have the full information to apply some policy because we might not have made the origins HTTPS. I guess if we made the origins HTTPS query like in parallel, but like, so I don't have like a concrete point here or here, just like if we say yes here, we need to go back and revisit the other thing.
So the way stickiness works here, you do make a query for the origins HTTPS records.
Okay.
And then stickiness only applies if in the list of options, you see the alternative you landed on before.
Okay, so I guess, yeah, all right, that probably works.
All right,
okay.
Tommy.
Yeah, I'm next. So I do think we need some stickiness, and so let's keep having the conversation here. Of the alternatives, I like both what Ben and Eric were saying. I had originally gotten Q to suggest both of those, and they said them for me, which was fantastic. To clarify, if we do, let's say what Ben was suggesting, I think we can get rid of alt only.
Yes, probably.
So I think potentially getting rid of alt only would address what Alex was bringing up, because given the way that stickiness works, when I come in from a brand new connection, I always am doing DNS again for the origin. And in that list, I get back multiple options. All of these options are ones that I am allowed to use as the client. I do not always have to pick just the first one as the highest priority. If you are giving them back to me, I can choose. I can do happy eyeballs. I can do whatever I want with them. So from a load balancing perspective, the origin still is in control of that. And the only stickiness exists within the list of the things that you would be allowed to use regardless of any other previous connections. So I think when we limit that, then I think it fits well into existing load balancing models. And I think the only tweak is like alt only does bias that, because an alt only means that this is not something you'd otherwise use.
Right.
But if we don't have alt only and we use kind of like the hierarchy that Ben was referring to, then I think it is the same as like a blank slate client. You know, you're just kind of biasing amongst the allowable results, and therefore it shouldn't fundamentally change the properties of load balancing.
So I think in order to do it that way, you might want to be changing your DNS records in real time to say, I would like to not use this one as much, so I might need to in real time turn down its priority in the list.
Yes.
Okay. So less protocol functionality to be balanced by additional operational functionality.
Yes.
Okay. All right. And then I think the next one is our in-room alternative selection, where we have an adopted draft that is patching up things we know are issues with 7838. We have an individual draft that covers a lot of the same ground with this new header. Do we still want to fix 7838? Do we just say, okay, that work is not worth doing because we're about to call it obsolete? Do we adopt this and obsolete 7838 with this draft? Does this draft become the revision to 7838 and also describe the legacy thing? Or just say the legacy thing exists? This is more of a process question, but what do we want to do with these documents?
Eric Orth, I suppose it's a good place to have my big bucket of cold water in a lot of this. While I like a lot of this draft, I've been speaking to many stakeholders within Google at Chrome and Google server infrastructure. And the general consensus is none of this gives us enough advantage over alt service to be worth the massive complexity of implementing it. So from that perspective, it's like Chrome and Google servers aren't going to do any of this. And alt service, as much as we hate it, it's still the old terrible thing. It's what we're stuck with because that's what we already have implemented. So.
But you also don't implement the functionality of alt service that does this functionality to redirect.
That's true. We don't implement very much of it at all. So.
And the protocol selection piece is already covered by HTTPS. So I think what I hear you saying is don't adopt this and obsolete 7838.
Possibly. But yeah, overall, I don't know if I'm going to completely say don't adopt this, but don't adopt this until we at least either find more advantages that this can give us the other solutions couldn't give us, or find ways to massively reduce the complexity. Unfortunately, I don't have any major suggestions to do either of those, especially since massively reducing the complexity sounds good, but everything we've just been discussing this meeting so far is, yeah, we need to keep that complexity because everyone has different requirements here, and we need those to get done what everyone wants to do. So I don't have a good solution, but as it stands, it's the case of, yeah, sorry, we're not going to implement this, even though I like it. It's just I can't justify anyone spending time on it.
Fair enough. Thank you, Eric.
Hey, Lucas Pardue, Cloudflare. I think having noodled on this a bit, I work on a server side, and of the possible options here, I think maybe we just change the 7838 BIS to kind of tweak the text, but then obsolete the feature, because effectively HBS record obsoleted what alt service provided at a time that there was no other thing. So we're kind of just reflecting the reality we have here, but that this draft is potentially work worth doing that could be done in a separate document to then just make things better. but that we do have a completely usable solution today. And let's just make that clear to folks who think they want to use alt service to solve a problem that is solved by something else already.
Okay, so that's 7838 BIS, and then this is a separate work item. Okay.
Eric Kinnear, Apple. I'd second what Lucas said. I'm imagining the future conversations of, hey, 7838 BIS is actually a totally different thing. And it'd be kind of nice if those were separate. So I would obsolete that, adopt this, and say this is the reality of the world that we're living in. To actual implementation intent and things like that, I think some of the strategies employed by a number of websites, YouTube among them, require clients to do some things that cause problems in other areas, and moving more towards HTTPS records and things like that would help fix it. So maybe we should chat offline, but it seems as though there is a clear need for implementation by multiple major providers, YouTube among them.
Hi, Eric Rosenberg, Apple. I'm in support of this work. I think this is a problem worth solving. And I think this is a more elegant solution to something that we're doing that's very similar. So eager to implement this. And I think the questions around how the DNS resolution looks exactly are good ones. And we should keep talking about that. But I think this is headed in the right direction.
Thank you. All right.
Yeah. I was trying.
So fun. Eric?
I guess another question may be, like, I think an important thing before going and adding this complexity is trying to think to kind of determine that we do have enough critical mass of people willing to implement this. That was a problem we had with the first alt service was it was some nice functionality, but there wasn't enough. But outside of the upgrade to Quick, we never really got critical mass on people wanting to actually use it for interesting things. So with this, a question might be, are there some other bits of functionality that are worth bringing to this that would make it attractive enough to actually bring it across the line? So for example, we talked early on about would we want to be able to have these be path scoped, and being able to have this be path scoped, especially once we fix some of these stickiness issues, might solve enough problems to make it more worthwhile for sets of people.
Thank you. Martin?
Yeah, so I want to make it kind of clear. There's no real advantage to clients in doing this except indirectly. And the reason that I'm participating in this work is because I'm hearing from people who operate larger server infrastructures that this is advantageous to at least some of them. I'm hearing from some of them, they're like, we concretely just do not care about this stuff, and we don't see any use for it. But to hear Eric say, well, you know, it's no good for Google, therefore we won't do it, I think I understand it. I don't think that's the attitude that Mozilla is taking on this one. And so we will look to implement something if we can see that there's enough value to the community of servers out there, if we can make the serving infrastructure that much more reliable or robust or efficient as a result of this, then that's something that's worth doing. This is going to take some time for us to get to, but we would like to do that as well. And I'm hearing that there are people that really want this, so that's good.
And we're at time now, so unless we have last comments, I think we should probably move on.
Right, thank you. But
oh, go for it.
Yeah, I was just going to agree with Martin there. So speaking for like client implementation on Apple's side, I think we would absolutely be able to support implementing this. We already do a lot of SVCB work. I agree that for the client, we don't particularly care, but I'm aware, you know, as we work with our server teams and other server teams, that, you know, we can kind of melt servers down when they're in the middle of trying to load shed. And I think, yeah, there is a benefit to not melting down the services we care about, and this is a very nice solution to that. So, and you know, we would be very happy to support it at the OS level for all apps. And so yeah, not all browsers have to support it, but we can definitely have it be applicable very, very broadly.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Great, thank you, Mike. That's encouraging. That seems like a good path forward. Next up, we're off of our active drafts now, and next up we're talking about other topics. And first up is Lucas Pardue, talking about H2 and H3 WebSockets discovery and detection. Lucas?
Are you able to get on?
Oh, I can't do it.
Can you request? I guess I can't approve slides.
We're having issues.
Okay, hang on a moment.
Oh, jeez.
I'm happy to do it.
Oh. See how long it works for?
I just need to approve him.
Oh, okay.
That's all I need, right?
Oh, okay.
Well, I mean, it could help to have, but all right, you should be good, right? Yay!
Yay! Thank you.
Success.
Okay, so this is a talk on discovering WebSockets over HTTP2 and HTTP3. This is kind of a joint piece from myself, Momoka, and Dragana. So the idea is that I'll present some of the problem space that we've been discussing for the last couple of years, and then we'll have some proposals that we think are solutions that are complementary to each other, presented by Momoka and Dragana themselves. And then we'll have some discussion to think if we should be trying to solve this at all, and maybe which of those ideas are worth working on. Next slide, please.
You're controlling it.
I have the power. So the recap here, we have 2 drafts already that are adopted RFCs, well, adopted and published RFCs, RFC 8441 and 9220, which basically define how to bootstrap WebSockets over HTTP2 and HTTP3 respectively. What this gives you in a nutshell is a WebSocket per request stream. And you take a request stream and convert that into the WebSocket carrying thing that just shuffles data back and forth. And you do that via the extended connect method, which looks like a normal HTTP request, but it has these special additional rule changes compared to the normal connect method as defined already in the core specifications for H2 and H3. So effectively, these 3 items, protocol, scheme, path, if you receive those without negotiating this extension first, and so this is a connect method, you should blow up and basically completely reset that stream without processing it any further, which is good, it's strict, it's rules, but what that requires, therefore, is that the client having received, the settings enable connect protocol value before having sent that request. Obviously, you have some timing and risk conditions here, but effectively, what we did is solve the problem of providing WebSockets for HTTP2 that we didn't solve at the time of HTTP2 standardization, and subsequently did, and amazing. But what we didn't do is kind of constrain that specifically down only to WebSockets. We created this new extensibility mechanism and didn't really think through all of the ways that people might do this wrong. We created a spec that fixed a problem and at the same time implemented a bug without really realizing what that was until people came to try and use it. So maybe another topic for EDM one day, Tommy. But yes, we have this protocol pseudo header that is effectively an infinitely variable value. So we have the value itself is something from the HTTP upgrade tokens registry, which is you just go and register stuff. Like there's not much control. The ones we have already is the WebSocket value itself. We have Connect UDP now. That's work that was finished and published as an RFC from Mask. And we have work in progress things like Web Transport or Connect IP, Connect TCP. I expect other things to come. And so everything works, but it's specifically for WebSocket, say, it's difficult because I just mentioned Mask. The way you discover a Mask proxy was an item on their agenda this week, but effectively it's kind of an out of band thing that you don't go and browse a website and discover you have a mass proxy and try and use this thing. It's something else. But for WebSockets, you potentially do. And so you would see the scheme WSS:// in the real world. That's the way it happens. And so if you see that at the same time of having a connection to the same server that is serving this, which isn't necessarily true, but typically is, the settings enable connect protocol value is a really strong signal that extended connect is supported, but potentially a weak one that WebSockets are. You would think that if you served up a URL that you would support the thing, but that's always true. And so what happens is the client has to take a bit of a gamble and pick something that it thinks has got the best chance of succeeding in order to succeed and not have to hit some kind of retry logic or additional round trips or trial or whatever way you do that. And then some of the kind of choices that the client has to make or gambles are to create a new HTTP 1.1 connection and do an upgrade, like the old style of WebSockets. That's most likely probably going to work because it's been around for so long and we have the legacy and blah, blah, blah. But we want to do the new cool thing because there's advantages to doing WebSockets over H2 or H3 in that you can multiplex things and get a shared congestion controller and all of these other stuff. And we've already defined that extension point. People should potentially want to use it. So like I said, you have to wait for the settings and then you send a request that might fail because actually the protocol value that you send in there isn't actually supported, and that can be signaled by a failure response. But if you do already have a H2 or H3, you probably do already have the setting as well. And you can send the extended connect, but that could potentially fail again as well. Martin?
Yeah, I think there's one thing that is worth observing here is that you've been given a URL that points at this particular name. And so for your new H2 connection, this is really only a sort of gamble in the sense that that maybe it's available on H1 and the H1 is there, but you've negotiated up to H2 and the H2 server doesn't support it. I think that's really the key here is that you've got multiple underlying HTTP versions that are available and only some of them contain the capability that you're looking for, which is really terrible, by the way. This is an awful situation we're in.
Thank you for that clarification. That's great. Tommy?
I was also trying to get clarification. So is the entire scope of what we're talking about for the gambling and the different options just different HTTP versions to the same origin? Like I'm trying to load a particular URL and I could connect it over H1, I could connect it over H2 or H3 if I know it supports H3, and I just want to know what I should try?
Effectively, yes, but it's complicated because of we have multiplexing in H2 or H3, so you could reuse the connection you have, but right. If it's 1.1, you couldn't, because as soon as you do the WebSocket upgrade, then you would like trans all over the connection you do have already. So you would typically have maybe browser people speak to me, but you would have another set of connection pools or a connection pool to do this, and that has its own problems and restrictions and caveats because it can interfere with the pooling behavior that some clients do.
Okay. I guess my kind of reaction here, because it seems like the main benefit we're getting, and again, please clarify if I'm misunderstanding, but is that we would be losing a round trip because we have to do the connect request and see that it fails, assuming we already had H2. So if we start from Greenfield and we don't have a connection pool up, if we're gambling, we already have to bring up potentially 2 TLS connections, wait for settings, do a connection. And so I'm just wondering, like, is that one round trip in this failure case for a deployment that has inconsistently deployed their WebSocket support? Like, is that round trip going to be a big enough benefit to justify a new setting or like kind of technical work here?
I mean, in my opinion, yes, but I think the ambiguity here is that it isn't I don't know, you go and do it over HTTP 2 and 3 and it fails, and what is the failure? Like, I couldn't I can't actually do that. Did it fail because that WebSocket resource doesn't exist? Did it fail because you asked for it over the wrong version? There's not, well, so some of the slides will come onto this, but there's not a good, strong signals that we can give to the client to tell it what the situation is. There's weak signals with ambiguous definitions of what they should do. Hence, we keep spinning on this problem of should we fix it? Well, we can probably just do it on the implementations. And there's a lack of consistency here, generally in the ecosystem.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Bhavna from Apple. Quick question. I sat through the last All Service B presentation. How difficult would be to fold this step 1, 2, 3 into the previous proposal? Because this makes it harder on the client side. Just bootstrapping a WebSocket is going to take a long time because we have to try multiple options. But
we have that in the upcoming slides. So you've given us clairvoyance, as Mike might say, in
Cool, thanks.
You've got, I'd say, a little less than 10 minutes.
Okay.
Nidhi Jaju, Google. So I'm just wondering, what if we have a server that supports different protocols on different paths? Like the setting applies to the whole connection. So you still have a chance it's not supported when you send the connect request.
True. That's just another dimension of problem that we might have. Yeah. So I don't have the answer. That's why I'm trying to fix it today. Cool. And so we probably covered some of this just during the discussion, but effectively, if you do some archaeology on the mailing list, we've been on and off discussing this for about 2 years. We have different views, not shared by all. These are kind of my interpretation of what the list has said, that the availability of a resource and authority is not tightly linked to the HTTP versions available when connecting to that authority. There's latency risks, but maybe they're fine. But it's a bit like how many retry do you do? How deep does that recursion happen? Like, it's all complicated and hard to explain to developers who typically just want to use these things to get on and create interesting experiences on the internet. So it's opaque, it's a bit non-deterministic, and that doesn't seem like something protocol should do. And we have more extended connect on the way. This problem didn't really exist when the initial RFC defining the setting came out, but we do live in a world now where there's things coming down the pipeline. And I think personally, it's time to try and solve this problem before we hit the hard kind of cold face of the internet, where people start deploying stuff and clients, people who implement these things, just say it's too hard, and we give up. That adds just a horrible friction to usage of the technologies that we're defining, which again seems to defeat the purpose of defining them in the first place. So the question we have for the working group is, should we fix this? Should we try and mitigate it? Should we try and avoid it, or just ignore the problem and just say live with it? It's fine. So better advertisement could provide stronger hints, reducing the risks. This isn't about saying we have a complete omniscience and a worldview that's going to always be correct. The internet's the internet, things will fail. But if we can give stronger hints, we can probably have a good enough solution that solves the pain points that I've been trying to highlight. And for that, we have 2 different separate complementary proposals from 2 different authors that 1 or 2 could be adopted. I don't know. We're trying to figure that out today. See the next slides. Maybe there's some other options we're not thinking of. We could just have better semantic HTTP feature discovery altogether, which is something of feature discovery in HTTP kind of exists, but not at this level. We're talking like options to query HTTP version specific features, maybe. But we can just get better response status codes. In the past, we've talked about using a 421, 426, or the kind of the error codes we have in H2 or H3 of a version fallback. But in my opinion, those things are not really suitable or expressive enough precisely for this other problem. Defining a new error code just for this thing seems like way too much effort and not really worth it, in my opinion. We could require just deployments to support everything. so that the client doesn't, it still gambles, but it's going to, the house, well, everyone wins. But, in my view, that's not realistic. There's always going to be a new thing coming down the road, and you can't support it on everything. And we might add new versions of HTTP in the future, and we keep increasing the matrix of potential problems or work to do. Or we can just live with things and do nothing, and that could be fine. So we're going to go on to the proposal aspect of it now. So Momoka.
Hi, Momoka. This will be the current problem with just extended connect knowledge. So if there is a current connection, if there is an existing connection with an H2 server, and the client discovers a WSS scheme, if the server supports WebSockets over HTTP2, it'll be best for the client to send WebSockets requests by using the extended connect and making a WebSocket connection. And if the if the server does not support WebSockets over that HTTP2 connection, it'll be best if the client creates a new HTTP1 connection and does upgrade. And if the client does not choose to do those things, it will have penalties, as we have already talked about. So my proposal is adding a new settings enable WebSockets settings parameter. I don't think this is like the best solution, but I think this is the easiest and simplest solution. Because we already have a settings enable connect protocol settings parameter, and WebSockets has settings enable web transport. I'm like, why not have a settings enable WebSockets settings parameter? So if the server supports WebSockets over H2 or H3, it will set the settings enable WebSockets to true, to 1. If it doesn't, it will send it to as 0. So what the client behavior will be. So if the settings parameter, if the settings enable WebSockets parameter is not sent from the server, the behavior of the client will, I guess it will depend by the implementation. It might just it might make a new HTTP1 connection and do upgrade. It might try to use WebSocket over HTTP2. It will vary from implementation. But if settings enable WebSocket equals 0 is sent on the settings parameter, a new HTTP1 connection will be made and upgrade will be done. If settings enable WebSockets equals 1 is sent, the client will use the current connection and do extended connect and make a WebSocket connection. Okay, so I think now it's Dragana's turn.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. My proposal, it's really old one. I just did an update on that, is to try to discover which versions of HTTP support WebSockets before actually making a connection. And this will be reusing HTTPS records we use now for discovering HTTP3, for example. Next slide. It just adds a new key, WSS, that has the value as a list of ILPNs that support WebSockets. So, of course, the endpoint needs to support these versions as well. So LPN needs to be listed in the LPN key as well. Next slide. And what the client behavior will be, it's just if the key is present, there is strong indication that the WebSockets are supported over H2 or H3 or both of them. And the client can start using them. This is just a attempt. Maybe the connection will fail because some change happens in this infrastructure. If the key is not present, the client should just fall back and actually use HTTP 1.1 or choose to gamble. yeah, that's it. Next slide. It's yeah.
Conclusion. Okay.
I like to wrap things up, and so yeah, because it's been going on for 2 years. I think what we're looking for as a group, the group of 3 of us here, the group of the working group is, can we get any consensus that we should even try and fix this thing? And if so, let's quickly align on what those fixes should be. We have these 2 proposals. Should we adopt 1, 2, come up with some new ideas? Can we just draw a line under this thing and give some clear signals to the world on what the heck they should be doing?
So we have a pretty substantial queue, and we also have very little time. So I guess my interest as a chair is, does the working group feel that this is in scope for the HTTP working group, and then is this an interesting problem area for us to work on? Does it make sense for us to do those hums? I mean, do we want to try and get through the queue? I'm still a little worried that we're going to use all of our time and not even get through that queue.
Well, I guess, do we think it's more important to get through this than the other?
Right. Right.
I guess Ben's in the queue to come, so.
I personally, I'd like to hear from Ben, because I know Ben has had some different opinions to myself on the list, and we've had some discussions. So maybe,
okay,
just in case it's a contrasting opinion to what has been presented, I think would give a fair representation to the group.
If the queued folks who don't have issues they want to bring up, if we could ask you to dequeue yourselves, if you feel that that's okay, that'd be really helpful. And I saw the queue update at least, which is a good sign. Yeah. Let's go through it, and we'll just ask people to be very brief. Mike.
Mike Bishop, so you started off your presentation with an explanation of why this is a general problem with Extended Connect, and then you've presented solutions that are specific to WebSockets, and there's a disconnect between that strategy. I think we need a general solution for a general problem.
Thank you. Ben. Oh, sorry, Tommy, you were.
Yeah. Kind of actually contrasting what Mike was saying, I'm concerned that this would become a precedent, particularly for the settings, because it's, as Nidhi was pointing out, it doesn't actually solve per path problems. So I don't think it is really sufficient, and it creates a precedent for having tons and tons of settings for which we already have an extensibility field, which is a protocol. I think between these, the RR, it seems to be the only one that actually would guarantee fewer round trips. And so if we're going to do anything, I would prefer that we do that. But I just mainly want to see that we don't propagate this, especially because it seems like once you have newer deployments, like anyone who's supporting supporting web transport could also support H2 WebSockets. And so I feel like this actually can be a non-problem, because if you support web transport, then you have this potential conflict, but it's very unlikely that someone's going to have a WebSocket server that is the same host or the same path as something that's also doing like Connect IP or Connect UDP at this point. So I don't think it's actually a practical issue.
Ben, and again, briefly, please.
Hey, so yeah, yet another variation. I don't have any real objection to either of these because they're narrowly tailored to the WebSocket problem, and we have this very specific weird WebSocket problem. I don't really view it as worth solving. I think WebSockets are, being replaced. And if you want to use modern transports, then you should use web transport. And I think we have evidence now from Connect UDP and from web transport that actually we can, when we define these things, define protocols that work across all HTTP versions. And so we should be leaning into solutions that do not require the client to try to figure out which version support which features. Everything should just work on all versions except for WebSocket because of this historical problem. And if we want some kind of escape hatch for extreme situations where sorry, it doesn't work on this version, retry on a different version, I would be okay with that as a
Okay, Bhavana?
I agree that this needs to be solved mainly because stickiness to WebSockets is not going to go away anytime soon. So this is a problem that needs to be solved. However, there is one thing that I didn't understand in either proposals as to how you would, how the client would pick the application level protocol that it needs to talk to with the different servers, whether it's H2 or H1. With traditional WebSockets, you can you can add which protocol you're interested in talking to in one of the headers. Just that is something that whatever path you're going to take, that needs to be addressed as well. Yeah.
Eric.
Eric Kinnear. Two thoughts. One, I think using the RR is tempting because it's really nice to know everything as upfront as we can and not find out like once we've kind of gotten there. This is essentially trying to optimize an edge case. And so if we're going to optimize it, we might as well actually optimize it. The other piece is in Extended Connect, the protocol field is currently single valued. And if we're talking about optimizing the case where we might have wanted one protocol and there might be another, I could imagine a world in which it would be nice to say, hey, I'd like to talk web transport to you, but if you don't, I'd be okay talking WebSockets, and let people pick from there. But that's a whole nother can of worms that we may not want to open. So it seems a little iffy.
And David.
David Benjamin. So I agree with Ben overall that like we really should just get out of this heterogeneous like support thing. It causes too much of a headache. For the DNS thing, the problem is there are multiple patterns of protocol negotiation. For Quick, we do basically server presents at DNS level and client choose. But for H1 versus H2, it's client presents in the TCP in the TLS client hello, and then server chooses. And so if we do something that only works in the HTTPS record, we still have this retry case where because of mismatch between the server and the DNS, we think there's H2, but we're actually out of date. And so then the server picks H2 because we didn't tell it, hey, I only want H2 if you support WebSockets. So I think if we're going to do that, the right answer is to go reflect it into ALPN, because ALPN is something that is equally supported on both. And I know now everyone is groaning, but we really need to get more comfortable defining ALPN values.
Okay. So I guess from my standpoint, it sounds like there's definitely interest in more discussion here, and there's interest in solving the problems that people have. I think it sounds like it is in scope for this group. I don't think it's in scope anywhere else. It seems like we need to talk more. And so maybe what I'd suggest is let's take it to the list. Maybe if you want to form a design team, we can talk about that. And if we can get to a place where we think we know what we're doing on the list, we can do a call for adoption of proposal and go forth. And if not, well, we have San Francisco, and we can give you a more substantial block of time, I think. Does that sound reasonable to you?
Right.
Yeah.
I think a design team for this would be the most efficient use of everyone's time. So
yeah, if some of the folks who talked in the queue today would be interested in joining that design team, that would be great. But we can take that to the list and figure this out.
Can we make you the point of contact for that kind of coordination?
Yeah.
Yeah, great. Okay. Make sense?
Yep. Thank you all.
Thank you. Okay. We got 5 minutes. Dave Benjamin is next.
No, Ben Schwartz.
Oh, sorry, Ben Schwartz.
Do we need to do something?
I don't know if we need to do something. I'm lost.
Slides requested.
Yeah, approve.
Oh.
Just click the green button for him.
Right.
Okay, let's be quick. So last time I presented a thing called modernizing HTTP proxies. People said, you know what, just that covered two different things. People said, let's just talk about TCP proxies. Okay, so this is basically half of that draft. So just a reminder, this is the status quo. You've got your classic HTTP connect, where you have a proxy that's defined by an origin, and then you want to connect to something through that proxy. So you specify it in the request, and also the host header also specifies the origin of the thing that you're the host and port that you're trying to reach, not the proxy's host and port. That is something that I learned in the process of writing this, and thanks to people who helped corrected me on that. The mask proxy systems that we've just defined for UDP and IP, the proxy is identified by a URI template, and it uses the extended connect paradigm to reach the destination. So the destination is encoded in that case in the path, and the authority or host header identifies the proxy. So that's very different. And for old-fashioned connect, this creates, in my view, some pretty serious problems. There's no path, so you can only have one proxy per origin. If you have different proxy disciplines that you want to apply, different exiting from different points in the network, whatever you want to do, you can't do it because you can only have one proxy per origin. You have to split any distinctions in behavior across different origins. And there's also no host header to identify the origin within the connection, so you can't virtual host proxies on a shared IP, and you also can't use the defenses that our drafts recommend against origin identity misbinding attacks. That's a subtle point. So the proposal here is to define something that looks very much like the mask proxies, except simpler for TCP. So it just works exactly like Connect UDP and Connect IP, but for TCP. Proxy is identified by a URI template, and otherwise everything is very similar to that. Notably, this is not using the capsule protocol because it's unnecessary. So it's much, much simpler than Connect UDP. So I think this is a useful thing. It's basically a prerequisite if you want to be able to support TCP proxying on shared infrastructure. It makes it a lot easier to deploy TCP, UDP, and IP proxying support together. And I'm seeking adoption here.
So I queued myself. I guess clarification question and maybe a bit of an opinion. Do you intend to deprecate the original connect mechanism at all? Or is this just?
I view that as something that has
an enormous.
I view that as something that has an enormous install base. I can't really conceive of deprecating it. I guess we could, recommend that new systems use this new thing if people really like it.
Okay. I think, if you want us to define this as, hey, look, here's a convention to have a resource that has a certain interaction mechanism, that's fine. I have no issue with that. So I'd support adoption on here. David.
David Skenazy, mask enthusiast. So first, speaking as someone who is like deploying a fleet of mask servers as we speak, I don't really see the need for this. We already have Connect implemented and it works. So we probably wouldn't implement something new, and we already have something that works. Where this concerns me is...
Sorry, just to interrupt. We are almost out.
Oh, yeah.
We are actually
really
out of time. So
really quickly then. Now you have two ways to do things, and you run into all the problems that we just had with the WebSocket over multiple things discussion, and this is going to make all that really hard from a browser perspective. Like when I get configured with a proxy, what do I do? So I think this will make things more complicated. So I would be against adopting this personally.
So I think that from the browser perspective, it's extremely straightforward because there's no confusability between the configuration strings. So if you're configured with a TCP proxy identified as an origin, then it's a classic Connect proxy. And if you're configured with a TCP proxy that says target host and TCP port in a URI template, then it's this style of proxy. There's no ambiguity.
Okay, good point. Then I'm no longer objecting. I'm neutral.
Martin Thompson, I think this is a vastly superior design, and we should probably adopt it. Are you going to update proxy.pack?
Well, that's a trick. There is no standard definition of proxy.pack.
I agree with Martin. So I do support this. I think it'll take a long time before you see a lot of people moving to this, but I think we should define it now, and then we expect in like 5-10 years, maybe something will actually move to it. I like the fact that we can differentiate by the path for configuration. And one feature I would like you to put in there is doing what Connect UDP said, that you're allowed to send data before you get your response to make sure that you can get things faster. That's ambiguous in the current Connect.
Agreed.
Kazuhoko, I just wanted to ask about the use case. I mean, it seems that the use case being sold here is that there could be multiple Connect endpoints running on the server. Though I kind of wonder if, I mean, we can get the same effect by using the authorization, because if you open multiple Connect endpoints without authorization, then the client can use either one. So I was kind of wondering what the point is, or what the application that you have in mind is.
Sure. For me, the clearest application where this is unambiguously needed is if you have an extended Connect capable CDN that is forwarding extended Connect requests back to an origin backend. We've set all this up very carefully so that CDNs can be protocol agnostic when they are when they're doing that. They don't really need to understand the colon protocol field, and they certainly don't need to perform the TCP proxying there themselves. So mask can be routed through a CDN in this way, Connect UDP and Connect IP. We don't have an equivalent capability for TCP.
I see. Thank you.
So it sounds to me like there's enough interest here to probably take it to the list and maybe do a call for adoption. Yeah. So Tommy and I we'll talk to you, and yeah, expect to hear more about this on list, I'd say. Thank you, Ben. All right. So we're out of time. We had one more item. I have the availability hint spec, which I put out a little while ago. Take a look at that if you can. We'll take that to the list. But the intention is to replace the variance draft, which previously replaced the key draft. So we'll see how that goes and try and handle that on the list. And if we can't do that, we'll talk about it maybe in San Francisco. Okay.
Thanks, everyone. See you next time.
What's that? Mike? Priority.